Please consider supporting Black Women United YEG for the protection and advancement of Black women and girls in Alberta. You can learn more about them at bwunited.ca. They are always looking for donations and volunteers. So please, again, support Black Women United YEG for the protection and advancement of Black women and girls in Alberta. Again, that website is bwunited.ca.
Hey, this is Nicole calling from Hamilton, and I needed to let everyone know that I really proudly support Vish and Creative Control. I have for many years, I will for many more, as long as he keeps delivering these amazing interview podcasts. When you hear one of Vish's interviews, you think he's known this guest for years, they're good friends, but the truth is he approaches every interview, whether it's sort of up-and-coming indie artists or established icons or like famous, intimidating comedians with a really deep, genuine curiosity, as though he's never met this person, and the same really warm candor, as though he's known them forever. I think it really lends to a great chat, no matter who he's talking to, and for that reason, I think you should throw Vish, $1 a month? He's got jokes. The jokes make it worth it. Support Creative Control on Patreon.
To make your flexible monthly donation to Creative Control, please visit patreon.com/Creative Control today. I'm Vish's wife, and remember, when you name a dog Janet or Timothy, you are dragging humanity down just a little bit.
Creative Control with Vish Khanna.
Ann Powers is an esteemed and prolific music critic and author who is currently based in Nashville, Tennessee. Originally from Seattle, Washington, Powers has written for publications like the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times, among others, and over the last decade, she has worked with NPR, writing and talking about music and culture in columns and newsletters, and as a frequent guest on podcasts and programs like All Songs Considered and Morning Edition. Powers has also written acclaimed books, including Weird Like Us, My Bohemian America, and Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music. Her latest book is an astounding one called Traveling, On the Path of Joni Mitchell, a uniquely structured biography of the legendary Canadian artist that also serves as a meditation on criticism, fandom, and what it means to know, or think we know, our favorite musicians. Anne and I connected recently to discuss things like her entry point into Pacific Northwest punk rock, including seeing bands like D.O.A. and Nomeansno, how she positioned her role in writing this book after years of research and dozens of interviews, and her decision about pursuing an interview with Mitchell herself. Perspectives on motherhood and what it meant for Mitchell to be a woman in music in the 1960s when she began to establish herself, and how that era is perceived today. The problematic critiques of that time period by Mitchell and other artists, Anne's own trajectory as a lover and critic of music, what it means to interrogate the work of people you love, how artists who have medical scares or are getting older, like Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, and Neil Young, might themselves gain a new appreciation for their own work and audiences, Anne's upcoming book tour dates, other future plans, and much more. A part of the Entertainment One network with the support of listeners like you who follow and subscribe to this listener-supported and donor-driven podcast. Spread the word about it. Leave nice reviews and ratings on your podcast platform. That actually helps more than you might realize. And make flexible monthly donations at patreon.com/Creative Control, which is the primary and most reliable way for podcasters like me to make a living, and where a $6 a month subscription means you can access every single episode of the show in its entirety, which is not the case without that subscription. So $6 and up every single episode. Otherwise, no. Anyway, you can learn more about... I didn't mean to say no so firmly, but that's true. It's just the truth. You can learn more about this if you have the means and the inclination to support me and my work. You can learn more about this at patreon.com/Creative Control. Thank you so much. Plus in-kind support from independent businesses like Pizza Trocadero, The Bookshelf, and Planet Bean Coffee, respectively, in Guelph, Ontario. and Granddad's Donuts in Hamilton, Ontario. This is episode 875 of Creative Control, featuring the brilliant and lovely Ann Powers, with your host, me, Vish Khanna. Hi, Ann. How's it going?
Hey, Vish. How are you today?
Oh, I'm very well. It's an honor to get to speak with you. Where in the world are you today?
I am in Nashville, Tennessee, where we are in the cicada invasion, and it's been interesting. Land of the lost down here with little tiny dinosaurs flying around everywhere.
Yes, for those who haven't been keeping track of the news, I believe the cicadas are unburied and flying through the air. Is it like, can you see them? Do you just hear them?
They actually, because we've also been having tornado warnings this weekend, they're not quite as visible and audible as they are when really bad weather comes. They kind of retreat because obviously you don't survive for millions of years or whatever. They have survived without being smart, so they take shelter when the weather's bad. But yeah, it's a trip. I was in Europe, and I came home, and all the trees were like plastered with these beautiful but disturbing looking creatures.
Yes. Are they loud? Do you hear them?
Oh my gosh. Have you seen Apocalypse Now?
It sounds what you're describing is apocalyptic or biblical, even, if I may. It sounds like something's going on.
It's truly. But anyone who's listened to music, loud music for as many years as I have, already has cicadas in their head from the tinnitus or tinnitus or however you like to pronounce it. So
Yes, that's right. Well, Ann, it's great to meet you and see you. Yeah? I hope you survived the cicadas and the tornadoes. How long have you been in Nashville exactly?
We've been here since 2015, so we're coming on 10 years. My husband, Eric Weisbard, teaches at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, so we were living there for about 6 years. And then when he got tenure, we both decided we wanted to live in a bigger city and somewhere where there was a great music scene. And this is close enough that he can commute, I mean, he drives down there. It's kind of a pain, but
yeah, that's not. How far is that? How far?
Oh, he's about 4 hours, but he stays overnight when he's teaching.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Yeah. But he's actually in Sweden this year on a Fulbright, and I've been lucky enough to spend time over there this year, so that's been just delightful. It's been really nice to explore Scandinavia. I highly recommend it.
Nice. Had you been before?
I had never been, no,
cool.
And I completely fell in love with the region. Oh my goodness, it's so great, and I have a different favorite country every week, I guess. Right now I'm very hot on Finland. Highly recommend Helsinki.
I've been to Oslo, Norway. Might be the closest I've been to that.
Oslo is beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful place. It reminds me a lot of the Pacific Northwest where I grew up. So,
okay.
The northern vibe is one. As someone who's living in the South, I loved having a chance to be around that kind of Northwestern BC style environment again. It's funny because maybe some of your listeners will get this. I was texting with a friend when I was in Oslo, and I was in the sculpture park, and she was in Orcas Island up in the San Juans, just close to Victoria. Mm-hmm. And she was sending me pictures, and I was sending her back, and they looked like we could have been taking each other's pictures. They're so similar.
Oh, wow.
So that was really cool,
So it sounds like you're quite familiar with Canada, or at least BC. Did you go up there quite a bit, living in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, I did. Growing up, especially as a teenager, drinking age was a little
that's
younger.
right, yeah.
And as a young punk rocker, I loved the whole scene around bands like D.O.A, and that was kind of the scene that I was connected to. And yeah. And then I have some close friends who live now in the Whistler area, but so I've spent a lot of time up in BC.
Did you get to see Nomeansno at all? Not as much.
No.
Okay.
No,
were you not a fan? Not a fan of Nomeansno?
I didn't. No, I don't know. I wasn't familiar, but maybe I was a teenager, so I had limited knowledge.
Yeah, they're in that D.O.A sphere, but for some people, Nomeansno are considered Canada's greatest.
Oh, No Means No. I thought you were saying No Nomeansno. I thought, who's Nomeansno? Is that like the girl with the dragon tattoo or something? No, of course I saw Nomeansno many times.
Great,
yeah,
great,
for sure.
I was going to say, we some of us think of them as Canada's greatest ever band, and love
absolutely.
them.
No, Nomeansno. I think there was like a whole West Coast scene, of like punk that had a kind of a new wave, or not really new wave, but like just an arty edge, and then like bleeding into hardcore up and down the scene, whether it was like Flipper in San Francisco or certainly all the bands that preceded the hardcore scene in LA. And I was in Seattle, and we had all these bands that no one remembers, but they all became, or some of them became, the bands everyone remembers. So like Mark Arm and Steve Turner from Mudhoney were in a band called Mr. Ep and the Calculations when I was in high school. That was just the craziest, loudest hardcore band ever, and I used to go see them all the time.
Wow. I mean, this seems like a nice enough segue into the music of Joni Mitchell, doesn't it? Hardcore punk and, well, Canada. We got the Canada thing there. You do come from the edgier aspects of music, rather. I mean, that was your first affinity. Was that louder stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, like many people, as a child or as a preteen or whatever, I liked pop, and, I was into Andy Gibb or whatever. I liked teeny bopper music, but pretty young I got into the Clash and all that stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I do want to get into your trajectory as a critic, as a writer, as a music lover, and these sorts of things. But I think we should begin with this wonderful book of yours. And I want to say congratulations. The book is Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. As I say, congratulations. How are you, as we're speaking, everyone, Anne's book hasn't come out yet, so reception is probably just trickling in maybe. But Anne, how are you?
It's been good so far.
Good so far.
It's good so far, yeah.
For what it's worth, it's wonderful. And I enjoyed it immensely, and it had me revisiting Joni Mitchell's entire discography, and I really enjoyed the experience of reading this book and revisiting music that, and to be honest, encountering some that I hadn't heard before. Yours is one of these books that gets me going on YouTube, of like, you're describing something that occurred historically. I'm like, I don't think I ever saw that. And then, of course, these days you can just like, I'm going to put the book down for 5 minutes and watch that time she was on the Dick Cavett show or whatever. And so it became very immersive for me, and I just want to commend you on that. But where was I going with this? Yes. How are you feeling on the cusp of the release of this book? How are you feeling about it? And what's the reception been like that's trickling in? Well,
I spent more than 7 years on this book, so definitely a relief that it's finally out is definitely an emotion I'm feeling. But this is my, I guess, fifth book, including ones I've edited that I published, and it never gets less nerve-wracking, publishing a book. And I just want to say to any of the aspiring authors or first-time authors out there, it's the feelings you're feeling. People who publish tons of books also feel those feelings. So, I'm nervous. But I'm happy because it's gotten good advance reviews in the trades, and people seem to really like it. And, I'm proud that I figured out how to tell this story in a way that was true to my own sensibilities and my own approach as a critic. I'm not a conventional biographer, so I had to find my way in. And as you know, Vish, since she's kind of a national monument in Canada, Joni Mitchell is a daunting subject. So, but I hope that people feel I've done her justice.
You frame the book in the introduction in the sense that you are a critic. This is not going to be. This isn't rather a hagiography or anything like that. Can you take us back to that? Like, why did you frame it this way, and why is your approach imbued with that notion of like, this is not going to be me kissing Joni Mitchell's ass? I'm going to actually delve into this critically. Where did that come from?
Even though she has a beautiful ass, according to one person who wrote to Rolling Stone in like 1969 that I published, or I quote the letter in the book.
Yes, so. her beauty seemed to be both distracting for some, and but also, I guess, a virtue at the time. Yes, exactly. Yeah. But sorry, yes. Yeah. Why did you frame the book as such, in your own positioning, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I think there's several different responses I could give to that question. One is that for my whole career, as a critic and as a music journalist, I've sort of interwoven personal insights and personal experience into my work. So it was a fairly natural approach for me. My last book that I published, Good Booty, was a history of music and sexuality. And that one I wasn't in at all. And honestly, I love that. I mean, I'm still really proud of that book, but it felt very foreign to me to write a book that I didn't have my own perspective clearly in. So this was a return, in a sense, to the way I feel most comfortable writing. But at the same time, there was a period early on where I was very uncomfortable with this subject because I was so intimidated by the notion of trying to do a conventional biography. And it took me working through those feelings and realizing that there were multiple ways in for me to really embark on the project. There are great biographies of Joni Mitchell that already exist. David Yaffe's Reckless Daughter, for example. I love Michelle Mercer's book, which is more of a combination of criticism and biography. But, obviously Malcolm Marome's classic book-length interviews with Joni. So there's a whole shelf. And I was like, well, what can I put on this shelf that is different and that represents what I do? That's where I went.
Now, you also make a point of, and I don't want to spoil anything, you have had limited interaction with Joni Mitchell over the course of your life, more than most of us might have. However,
I suppose that's true.
Yeah. However, most of us, you did not pursue an interview, and you talk about that, and that was purposeful. You also just said you were intimidated, and I don't know if that's because of the subject matter at hand or the notion of adding to the canon of biography. Let's talk about your personal relationship, I suppose, as any fan's personal relationship with Joni Mitchell might be. Why did you choose not to pursue an interview for this book? Let's start there.
The most honest response would be to say it was unlikely I was going to get one anyway. So, but on the other hand, not that unlikely, because I do have some close connections to Joni. And in fact, I have met her a couple times, and I interviewed many people who are very close to her, from Larry Klein, her ex-husband, to Brandi Carlile, who's been working with her so much lately. So I think it would have been possible, but that would have really reshaped the project so much. That would have taken me in the direction of a more conventional biography. And what I talk about in the book is two things. One, the larger phenomenon, I guess, of how famous people affect us, even those of us who are journalists. Vish, I'm sure you've experienced this as a podcaster. Like, you're talking to someone and their charisma is overwhelming or their legend is overwhelming. And do you ever really get to the heart of that person by direct contact? I don't know. That aura is so strong. So I wanted to resist that. And then I also wanted to be able to kind of examine her as not just a person and an artist, but also as a public figure and as an icon, if you will, overused word. And to do that, I needed to keep a little distance as well.
Well, this book is remarkable because it tells a story about Joni Mitchell's life and her paths, but it's also, I think, a meditation on fandom, as you may have just been alluding to, because music critics, I think we all mostly start out as music fans, and then we immerse ourselves in the worlds of these folks. And if you are both fortunate and unfortunate, you wind up falling in love a little bit with these people. And so your objectivity kind of shifts, or rather your objectivity, it's shifting all the time. I've loved certain artists, but I can acknowledge when they make a clunker,
Right.
With some, but others, I'm just unabashedly, my impulse is to like the thing.
Yes.
Right away.
Yes.
And so getting back to where I started from, this is also, would you agree, this is a meditation on not voyeurism necessarily, but this notion of being a fan, and how do you think and write critically about someone you might be in love with? Like, is that part of the deal?
Yeah, totally. And in fact, this book gave me an opportunity to do that in a unique way, because when I began the project, I was an appreciator of Joni Mitchell's work. And of course, like virtually everyone who's ever heard Blue, I loved Blue and I loved Hejira, the classics, but I wasn't a hardcore Joni fan. My generation, I'm 60, so I grew up with more the new wave icons and then came into my own in the 90s when we had the daughters, right? Tori Amos, Sarah McLachlan, the Lilith Fair generation. And I was really obsessed with Kate Bush, too, as a kid. So for me, I was like, those artists were my artists. Chrissie Hynde from The Pretenders. And so I had to find my way in to Joni fandom, in a sense, through this project. And one thing I tried to do was foreground how my perspective and my identification with her changed as I worked on the book. So, I was always like, how does this particular aspect of her work connect with my experience? For example, thinking about her encounters with sort of psychotherapy in the 70s and realizing that her great works like Hejira really articulate the ruminations of the mind. That brought me back to my own experiences of being brought into self-help therapy by my family in the 70s, or I don't know, the whole story of Joni and her daughter with whom she was reunited in the 90s. I'm an adoptive mom, so how did I connect as a mother, and how does the idea of Joni as mother challenge sort of conventional ideas of motherhood, and how do I relate to that? So being able to find my relationship with these different topics, it brought me closer to her. And by the end, I think you see, I am truly a fan.
Well, yeah, I don't see how you couldn't be. I mean, you're critical still. Let's not. You acknowledge when she has faltered, right? Like that's fair to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I take on some pretty sacrosanct subjects, let's say. So am I using that word right?
Yeah.
I definitely wanted to take on the most controversial aspects of her career and creative life. And beyond that, to be able to say, well, this wasn't her greatest work or whatever. There's limitations to this. But in the end, with the music, I did kind of find my way into all of it. And I hope that people follow me there. But yeah, I didn't want to be afraid of talking critically about her, which was another reason why I didn't want it to be an official biography.
You just invoked a few artists who are gendered as women, and you write about Joni, I think, trying to shake off this notion that she is an icon of femininity.
Yes.
Did this exploration give you of Joni's work, and just acknowledging some of the people you first sort of fell in love with, I think, as artists. Sorry, I keep saying fell in love. Maybe that's the wrong thing to say as a critic.
Oh, it's not wrong at all, especially for me when I was like 17 and got my first copy of Kate Bush's first 2 records or something. That was love.
Would you agree with what I said earlier? Like we do kind of fall in love with these people that we can relate to the most. Like you were talking about.
I think so.
Yeah.
So you know what I think it is? Yeah. I'm totally jumping on you. Sorry.
No.
Here's what I think it is. I think what happens is that you discover an artist and you discover some of their songs, or maybe even just one of their songs initially. And you hear a story that feels connected to your own story, that somehow speaks to you. And that story, by the way, might just be a sound. Like when I say story, I want to use it in the broadest way. So, it could be the lyrics and you relate to the lyrics, but it could also just be a performance or a sound, or like the wildness of Little Richard's voice or the delicacy of Joni Mitchell's voice, whatever. And you relate to it and you say, oh, I haven't heard that story told in that way before. And it's kind of my story. And that's when that identification happens. And that's when the love feeling starts. But I think others would argue with me and say, oh, no, you can fall in love with something completely different than your own story.
Yeah.
I think that's fair, too. But I still feel like that feeling of connection and being able to enter into the music somehow and then see yourself in it or hear yourself in it, even if it's completely different than your life experience. That's the bond.
Yeah, but I think where I'm at, and I've talked about this recently, because you were saying something earlier about like, do I, as someone who interviews someone on podcasts now, after years of being a print journalist and a critic and interviewing people, I've just been interviewing people forever. And
right.
And sometimes, these days in particular, I'm like, why do I do this exactly? Like, media is crumbling. I'm on my own completely, and I'm doing my best here. And I wonder
You're doing great.
Well, thank you.
You're doing great.
Thank you. But there is this delusion of connection on some level on the one hand. And I don't know about you, and I don't know if there's a corollary between what you've talked about here with Joni and trying to get to know her a little bit and trying to get to relate to her. These are very parasocial, like the heightening of parasocial encounters or whatever. I don't know how to put it. Do you think there's some corollary between how we're all relating to the people we admire and in some cases interacting with them a little bit, like whatever? Do you think there's some corollary between how we're all living now and your meditation on getting to know Joni, so to speak, as a fan?
Absolutely. And I'm hardly the first to note that, Joni Mitchell is usually held up as kind of the paragon of confessional songwriting, of someone who did expose herself. She hates that word, by the way, confession. But a lot of the parasocial relationships that we now view through the lens of social media and stuff, those same kinds of relationships were happening between fans and artists in the late 60s with this singer-songwriter cohort in particular. And I think that was another reason why it felt very relevant to talk about how Joni Mitchell handled revealing her own life, observing others' lives, and how she handled people coming back to her and saying, "Oh, you're speaking my life," because there's a direct correlation between that, what she was dealing with in the late 60s, early 70s, and what, say, Taylor Swift is dealing with today. It's on a different scale, obviously, or Beyonce or whoever. It's on a different scale, but it's that same question of like, how much does the artist hold for themselves? What are they sharing with us, and what are we bringing and demanding that they express, in a sense? And Joni's resistance to that, I think, is one of the most interesting things about her.
Yeah, and even just getting into semantic debates. As I recall, she resisted the notion of being known as confessional and instead shifted people to saying she was a penitent.
Yeah, penitent, which I think is so... Here I'm being parasocial, like I really know her, but I'm like, it's so Joni, because of course she found a word that, she probably read in a Herman Hesse novel or something, like she wanted to name it herself. And so she finds a word that's like just an inch off, that in the thesaurus would be a synonym, but there's shading there, and that was her gesture toward owning the experience, I think.
I think in recent years, because of upheavals and people actually speaking out against terrible behavior and whatnot, there is this notion of separating the art from the artist more. And I wonder if, like, did you find that with Joni? Like, because I know you get into some of her problematic postures. But you came out the other side trying, like, again, for those who don't know the story, I don't know, maybe we should tell the story of the character she created. And
yes.
Can we do that? Because that was a fascinating, as you delved into it, I was fascinated by the notion of her engaging in problematic behavior to address other problematic behavior and sexism and misogyny. And maybe that was a spoiler, but can you just tell us a little bit about that story? Yes.
So, we're talking about the character of Art Nouveau, also called Claude, who is a persona or an alter ego that Joni created in the mid-70s. She originally put on this costume in which she embodied a black man, an African-American man, particular style or persona of a black man. Really, I'm going to use the word like a pimp. She used that word, a street, someone who'd be hanging out on the street. She actually has many times told this story of like walking down Hollywood Boulevard. There was a Halloween party she was going to go to. She had to get a costume, walking down Hollywood Boulevard and seeing this guy, or walking by this guy who was kind of, she said he was walking with a diddy bop kind of walk, and you could almost see it. It's almost cartoonish in a sense.
Yeah.
But and he made a comment to her, and according to her, she felt his energy kind of enter her body. And then she goes to the costume store. She gets an afro wig and a fedora and some makeup to darken her skin. And eventually this evolves with a little help from some other people who loaned her some clothes. This evolves into this costume. You can find pictures of it online. She wears the costume on the cover of the original cover of Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, the album. And it also appears for just a split second in the movie Shadows and Light,
right,
which I have to say that actually got left out of my book, and that's one of my corrections, but it's in there.
Yeah.
It's in the film.
Yeah.
And so she really doubled down on her connection to this character. And in my chapter, I try to do a few things. First of all, I try to trace like the origins of Art Nouveau, and I have some theories about that. But more importantly, I ask the question, and I have to give credit to my friends Gail Wald and Daphne Brooks and Sonnet Rettman, who are some friends of mine, academics who read my chapter, and they encouraged me to really ask this question, which is, why did so many people, just think this was okay
Accept
for so
it.
long? Yeah, and that is really curious to me. So that was sort of what I really wanted to confront. And how and why do we, as fans, because we were talking about this before, Vish, as fans, how and why do we try to make room for accepting the unacceptable from our favorite artists? Like, what are the compromises we make in order to love our favorite artists even when they commit these transgressions? So I will say one update since my galleys have been out, and I'm not taking credit, but she's reissuing Don Juan with a different cover.
I see.
So
yeah.
There's still been no official statement of renouncing the Art Nouveau image, but she is reissuing it with a different cover, and I think that's really interesting. That happening in 2024. So
yeah, because at the time too, I mean, from what I can tell from your book and my own research, she was pretty, as a lot of people were, freely used epithets to make hard points. And that's another thing I try to talk about is like, I mean, I don't want to excuse it via context, but if you look at the context as clearly you did, this was a really common phenomenon among white artists in the 70s and I mean throughout history, really, even now. Do you feel that you can, because we've been talking about how do you get to know someone really, and in the context of an interview, like that's a performance in itself, like that's still not the real person really. But I've been wrestling with this thing in the last few years as I've lost people that I am in love with because of their work and having gotten to know them, and I've landed on like, why do I have this deep wellspring of loss and love for this person that I've only talked to a few times in my life or whatever. And it's because in most cases, I've been listening to their music since I was a teenager. And I think, and I've articulated this before, it kind of feels like I know an artist like that from their expression better than I might my own cousin, who I never talk to and doesn't right. Write songs. Do you think you can actually get to the essence of someone? And I don't mean this to follow the problematic thing we were just talking about, but maybe that is part of it. Art Nouveau is part of her deal. It's something she was trying to express. But do you feel like you can really get to know someone from their songs, from their expression, like that subconscious creative spark?
Yeah, wow, that's a fundamental question for us as critics, right? I mean, I think that we always have to be aware of our own projections, as we've been talking about. What we get to know is the work and the self that is built through the work, obviously, right? So, like, one thing I tried to do with this book was the idea of being on this path that's constantly diverging, and she's always just ahead of me, but there's always a different view. It's like when you're on a path and suddenly a view opens up and you're like, oh, wow, this territory looks different to me from this point on the path than it did over there. And that's sort of how I view my relationship with her work and with artist work in general. I don't think any great artist expresses only oneself in their work. So, let's jump over to Leonard Cohen, for example, another great Canadian artist with a connection with Joni. His work throughout his life gave us the kind of poet and spiritual master, gave us the rascal, the ladies' man, gave us the absolutely self-aware, almost not self-parodying, but like guy who would take himself down a notch. All these different people in one person. And I think that's what a great artist gives us. And that's what we all have inside of us, I believe.
Yeah.
So the gift that an artist gives us is insight into the multiplicity of all people. But do we really know them? I don't know. I mean, she's making choices. She made choices, for example, on Blue, on that album. Such a mournful, sad album and all this. But, you know, it was interesting to learn that when she was making Blue, she was actually pretty happy. You know, she was in her beautiful spring days of her relationship with James Taylor.
Yeah.
They were working together. He's on the album. While, yes, she expresses some regrets about her breakup with Graham Nash, or at least we think so, as far as analyzing the songs. Really, she was happy when she made Blue. So then it's complicated. It's like, were you happy? Were you sad? But you give us this gift of insight into your sadness, no matter what your actual mood was.
Maybe calling your album Blue and having it being lauded as this classic. Like, you listen to Accord and Spark and there's like a vibrancy. Like, I can't...
Yeah.
There's such a joy, and there's so much joy, I think, in her music. And,
yes, totally. And
humor and curiosity about sounds and phrasing. Like, it's remarkable stuff. So I always feel like she gets saddled with the wrong stuff because of, again, honestly, you call your album Blue, it has something of a somber. I think that's it. That's the classic. That's who she is. And I think you're fighting that. Maybe, I don't think you're fighting that, but you're trying to contextualize who she was era to era. And like, she's a human being. She's got different moods and tones.
Completely. And it's interesting. I have a chapter called The Sorrow, which is about sadness, women's sadness as a form of resistance. And that's an idea I borrowed from the theorist Sarah Ahmed. Mm-hmm. And I think about that with Blue in particular, and with Joni's sadder songs. There's always a way in which she uses sadness to kind of like say, I'm stepping away from the kind of conventional idea of romance. I'm like exposing the difficult side, the underside of these experiences. And in doing so, I'm asserting myself and my own freedom. And there's this struggle between, she talks about it, you know, it's like my favorite lyric of hers from Same Situation, when she talks about, you know, the struggle between her ambition and her desire to be loved. And casting that in a particularly feminine way. But that's more complicated than just, you know, I'm sad or I'm pathetic or whatever. And I think if we look at our favorite sad artists, you know, there's always that complexity. But sometimes we need to just receive it as like, I need a good cry. You know, that's the other thing that I was just thinking about, how it's funny, because why do we never celebrate when a song makes us laugh, you know, or makes us like scream, you know, but it's always like, oh, it was the waterworks. I was crying. Like, that's the pinnacle of what a song can do. And I don't know. I mean, Joni's music gives us all those emotions, not just the one.
I think you're inadvertently describing people's relationship with like the Academy Awards and how they don't respect. People don't value comedy. I mean, I know people who listen to the show know that I will often ask a seemingly serious artist about something that perked my ear that was humorous. And it's interesting how musicians, as you probably know, Anne, every comedian wants to be a musician.
And every musician wants to be a comedian.
Oh, they can't wait. You know, the songs are great, but I can't wait to try to bust out some jokes during this banter. Everyone really is kind of escaping these pigeonholes, I feel like, in our realm, in the arts world. And I want to go back to something I was trying to invoke about the women you cited earlier. And I don't want to be too clumsy about this, but I wonder if, having written this book and processing Joni's own relationship to being a woman, but not only a woman, being regarded as a feminist icon, or rather an icon of femininity, do you have any perspective both on her perspective on being a woman, but also what it means to be an artist who is a woman and is expected or gets sort of saddled with like, oh, you must be dealing with your feelings all the time and your emotions or whatever. I don't mean to be too reductive, but do you have any more perspective, having written this book, about Joni navigating life as a woman who's an artist, and also what that means maybe for women in the arts generally?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really gets back, it brings me back to like my struggle at the beginning of this project, because when I think about why did I not ever become like a huge Joni fan, say in my 20s, for example, I think it bothered me that she was so resistant to the idea of being a feminist. And I had a similar thing. This is strange, but with Patti Smith. But when Patti Smith made her comeback after living in Detroit with her husband and raising her family for a while, I read some interviews with her, and I was young at the time, and she seemed to be saying, I don't want to be a feminist. I valued my time like as basically a housewife, whatever. And as a young, like, absolutely besotted feminist, when I was like 20 or whatever, or even 18, and so believed in, and I think I was a little older when this stuff with Patty happened, but in my 20s, I was like pretty intense feminist.
Yeah.
And I was just like mad at these women for saying, no, don't put that word on me. I was just mad at them. And only through really immersing in Joni's journey around gender did I come to realize that it's so much more complex with her in terms of like the choices she makes to be representative or to express, as I was saying, the previously unexpressed, and to be resistant and to point out sexism. And then her other choice to be kind of a boy's girl and want to be one of the boys and renounce her feminine identity. And it's really the tangle of those things that makes the work so interesting.
Yeah.
But I think I initially was like, why aren't you singing I Am Woman or whatever? I don't know.
Well, I mean, one of the, in I guess this century, when did she reconcile with her daughter?
It was in the 90s.
It was in the 90s. Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah.
Time is a flat circle for me these days.
I totally agree.
But I mean, for those who don't know the story, but Joni gave up her first child for adoption, and then her only child, her only biological child. That's right, but very happily was able to reunite with her daughter, as you say, and in the 90s. Do you think that moment in her life shaped who she was? Rather, the moment, of, okay, I can't have, I don't think I can have a child, and I'm really maybe speculating. I'm going to tend to my work, I think, and not.
I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, living in Laurel Canyon, and I think you described the fact that women were kind of relegated to the even the singers we all love were relegated still to
even Cass Elliot, the hostess with the mostest. Lindsay Zolatch just wrote a great piece about Cass Elliot. There's a new book by Cass's daughter and telling that story. But anyway, I digress. But back to your question.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, do you feel that in retrospect, her giving up her daughter and giving up being a mother dictated the path she took, or her sort of emotional state of like, who am I? Am I sorry, I don't really say am I a woman, but there's something, right. There's probably something there, right?
Actually, I think there is something there. And one thing I realized when I was delving into the subject, and this is a subject I always want to talk about delicately as a part of an adoptive family myself.
Yeah.
I strongly believe that every individual adoption story belongs to the people in the story, and particularly belongs to the children. But, and the birth mothers and Joni as a birth mother, I think we want to acknowledge that the intense maturity and responsibility and sacrifice of being a birth mother. Our family, we have an open adoption. We have a relationship with my daughter's birth mom. Yeah. And I know this firsthand, So having had that experience was one that made me, I think, I just more sympathetic, sort of almost downplays it. It's just like, have a stronger feeling about that. But I do think the hold that traditional value still has on all of us, even those of us who think we're so hip and outside of it and progressive, the hold that those values has definitely causes anyone who deviates from the conventional way to have a family, to ask those questions that you're saying. I mean, I, as someone who was unable to give birth to a child, I asked myself, am I a woman? I've asked that question. Yeah. So I would not be surprised if Joni asked those questions after entrusting her child for adoption. Another interesting thing that I found out, Vish, is that quite a few women at that time either had children and entrusted them, in the music scene, had children and entrusted them for adoption, or their children were raised by their parents or other people. Yeah. Patti Smith entrusted a daughter for adoption. Maggie Roach of the Roaches entrusted a son for adoption. Aretha Franklin had children when she was very young that were raised by her parents, etc. So this was not uncommon in the world of music and entertainment. And those women who were raising their children really did face such a complex struggle with that.
Yeah, and I don't mean to do any kind of armchair psychology here, but I guess I wonder if you feel like her resistance to being categorized in terms of femininity might stem from pain, the pain of being a birth mother who gave up her child. And, like you said, it was quite common, but these were strong women working in a man's world. And I think seeing maybe some of their peers lose their work and their careers to domesticity. And I wonder if that, again, I don't know Joni Mitchell at all based on, I've read books, I know her music, right. But I guess I wonder if that's a little bit of embitteredness when she says, I'm not this feminist icon. But I think there might be some pain. Again, I don't know. I'm just speculating here.
Well, I as I said, I don't, I'm not going to speak for another's emotional experience of this profound and central experience in a life. However, I will say that we can connect the Joni who does have unbelievably boundless ambition. Really boundless ambition for her own work, and who felt the need to be great, not just good, but great, enter that level. You can definitely think about that drive as maybe connected to the choices, the personal choices she made in her life. But I also think that pretty quickly, once she came to Los Angeles and connected with David Geffen and Elliot Roberts and was becoming the Joni Mitchell we all know, she was engaged in this wrestling match with her own image, and with the image that the industry was imposing on her, this kind of delicate flower or whatever, and this creature that women could relate to more than men. And here, that was not the experience she was having in her life, and it wasn't the experience she was having as an artist. She was actually much more, as I write about, one of the boys and one of the few in the Laurel Canyon scene who was able to match them and who they respected, all those guys in that scene. So then to be marketed as this granny dress wearing songbird. And that's when she completely steps outside of that by the time we get to the 70s, and she's, and even think of what she wears, what the clothing she wears once she gets to the 70s and she's in pantsuits, and she's just dressing completely differently and presenting herself in a different way without diminishing her femininity, but still, playing the trickster
Absolutely,
figure.
Yeah, I know, and I appreciate that about her, and that in some ways she's a true artist in that sense, always moving, hard to categorize in any way.
Yeah.
Whether it's gender, musically, absolutely. I interrupt this episode of my own show for a brief thank you for hearing my call to support me and my work on Patreon. We have seen a lot of growth in Patreon support over the last little while, which is amazing because that's my primary source of income these days. And I love doing this job that I invented for myself a whole lot. Creative Control is a listener-supported podcast. Do podcasters receive any streaming royalties from podcast platforms? No, not any. Does podcast advertising pay the bills? Not for a show at this scale, no. Do all podcasters get paid by companies for their work like some celebrities do? No, most of us do not. We do this work to support our communities and because we love it. So what's the most reliable source of income for podcasters like me? crowdfunding platforms like Patreon. So if you love Creative Control with Vish Khanna and want to see it continue, please see the notes in this episode. Click on the link that takes you to my Patreon and its different donation tiers with various incentives and benefits, and support me and my work today. Thank you again so much. I said earlier I wanted to talk about your own trajectory, and we've hinted at it. In your 20s, you said you were like a hardcore feminist, and we talked about D.O.A. and Nomeansno and punk. You are a very esteemed music critic, and I wonder if we can talk a little bit about your own trajectory. How did we get here, Anne? What got you sparked into music, and then the notion of actually, covering it, writing about it, these sorts of things?
Right. Well, I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and I started writing about music for local music paper, The Rocket, in Seattle, kind of a famous music paper, back when I was in high school. So then I was really young, and I didn't really know what music writing was in particular, but it was an era when the English music press was very important, and particularly important to me. So I was definitely a kid who would go out to the indie record store or to Tower Records, the wonderful and now defunct chain, and buy NME and Sounds and Melody Maker and The Face and these magazines. And through those magazines, I learned about writing with a strong voice and writing with a point of view, and I kind of took that on. And then eventually I moved to San Francisco and I discovered the Village Voice. I worked for an alternative weekly in San Francisco. So I really am like a kid of the alternative press. Yeah. And at the same time, and I think maybe you relate, I think you might be a little younger than me, but you might relate to that combo of the alternative press and indie music and kind of grassroots underground music, and the feeling that gave me that I could take risks, and through music writing, I could be a risky kind of writer. And I got my undergrad in creative writing, actually, from San Francisco State. So, I had poetic aspirations or whatever. But reading someone like Greil Marcus, reading Mystery Train, for example, when I was 20 years old or whatever, it showed me that you could be really creative in music writing. And that's what I wanted to do. So that's how I got going.
And Mr. Marcus is, I think, renowned for clearly being impassioned about his subjects, but not pulling punches. So
yes, completely. Yes. And also connecting musicians and their work to the larger culture and to the mythologies of the U.S. and just political mythologies and historical mythology. So that was something I really took from him. And then I quickly got interested in cultural studies, and in grad school at Berkeley, I was reading people like Dick Hebdige and Simon Frith and Angela McRobbie, all these English writers, again, who were, writing about subcultures and writing about how politics infused music and how cultural positions. And then at the same time, I'm reading all these feminist writers. I'm reading all these second wave writers and putting it all together.
Yeah.
That was sort of where I was going.
I appreciate that. I wonder if we don't have to delve too deeply into this because it might be a 2-hour conversation, but I wonder if you can give me your perspective on the sort of state of cultural criticism. The internet has obviously democratized criticism. And as I alluded to earlier, I think traditional media platforms are in trouble in some regard.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
And so you get a lot of opinions now. We get a lot more opinions than we ever did. What's as someone who's been doing this a long time, what's your kind of opinion on where we're at with music criticism and music reviewing and all these sorts of things?
I feel like I'm walking on a very narrow bridge over a lake of fire. But I'm walking towards somewhere beautiful. That's kind of how I feel about it. Okay. So what I mean is, like, yes, the media, and hey, I work for a big media company. Yes. I'm very thankful and happy to work for NPR. Mm-hmm. So I'm not speaking as an official voice of NPR now, but I'll just say in general, conventional media is obviously suffering under the shifts that are happening due to technology, and has been for, I don't know, what do you think, Vish? 20 years, 25 years?
Yeah, at least, yes.
And as someone who's worked at alternative weeklies, at regular newspapers. I worked at the New York Times, LA Times, written for Rolling Stone, and spent all the different varieties of music press. I can see how new technologies are challenging each one in a different way. I feel the loss of the value of the written word because I'm a writer and I care about words on a page.
Yeah.
And that's what I do best.
Yeah.
At the same time, I do feel like if you're flexible with your idea of writing and what writing can be, forums like the video essay or or a podcast or, even, dare I say it, like really good TikTokers or whatever, people who are really artful about doing that stuff, they are innovative, and I don't think in music the video essay has come as far as it has with film. Like, I think there's amazing work being done in film criticism via the video essay, but I'm really interested in that forum. I'm interested in audio journalism. All of that said, and I should add, I think we're in this amazing moment for the diversification of the voices writing about culture. Yeah. And, for most of my career, I was one of a pretty small group of women or not white men writing about music. There was a very vital and is a very vital hip hop press that rose up kind of in parallel with the kind of alternative rock or indie coming out of indie press in the 90s. And certainly it's great to see those voices coming to the fore more. But it's so exciting to me to see how many women are in higher positions, how many people of color are in higher positions now. That said, you just got to shake your head and say, well, that's great, but it's a lake of fire, right? So,
yes.
So it's my emotions vacillate wildly, I guess. How about you? I mean, what do you think?
I feel mostly the same, and I'm a bit confused sometimes by it all. And I'm just relatively newly completely independent. I've worked for the CBC here in Canada, and I've still contributed to a magazine, but none of it. I also have 2 children and a house and a wife, and I'm like, is this self-indulgent? Like, I'm still clinging to this notion that talking about music, you mentioned like the last 20 years, things seem to have been further devalued, and arguably as soon as we all cheered on, I think some of us anyway, cheered on Napster and Netflix and all these things. But I don't think we counted on the fact that all of these platforms were actually showing us how devaluable art could be. That people are like, I want it for free. Yeah. I don't want to pay anyone any money for anything at all. Yeah. Because initially we're like, oh, software or torrenting. Yeah, that makes sense. Fuck those people. But now, now we're all kind of like, okay, musicians are not getting, any independent musician I talk to is like, yeah, I got to work a couple of jobs or whatever, and
can't tour, can't go out on the road, can't promote their records. Yeah.
So I'm not. I try to remain hopeful, and I try to do this work because I think I hope it helps people learn about things. But as a person actually doing it, I am confused, and I mean, just getting us back to this notion of connecting with someone like Joni Mitchell and criticism. It's an interesting time because you can pan an artist's work or you can praise it to all high heaven or whatever. But the other thing you can do is you can tag them. Like you can actually,
and they can respond.
Sometimes if they manage their own accounts, they can respond. So in the context of talking about knowability of an artist with someone like Joni, just following what we were just talking about, what do you make of that? The notion that, because I'm sure you come from a time where you might write for the Los Angeles Times or something, and you might hear tell a couple weeks later, Leonard Cohen actually read your review, or something. You might hear that, but you probably wouldn't, but you might. But now it's very much like, again, the notion of someone saying this album sucks. I'm going to tag the artist in it. I'm like, what are we doing? Like, what does this mean? What do you make of that level of interactivity and knowability, I suppose?
That's a great question. And I've been on both sides of this because, like, infamously, a few years ago, I reviewed a Lana Del Rey record, and she really hated my review, and she tweeted something negative. It was actually a positive review, but whatever. but she didn't like what I wrote. And I subsequently was attacked on the internet by her fans for like years, literally years.
Yeah.
I would receive these hateful Twitter DMs and whatever. But you know what? That's a virtual world. Thankfully, it didn't leak into the non-virtual world for me. Like I wasn't doxxed. Nobody came to my house or whatever. So that's good. Let's look at the other side of it. Recently, I reviewed the latest Taylor Swift record, which I liked quite a bit. And Taylor Swift, or her people, retweeted my review, along with maybe 2 or 3 others. And subsequently that review, and put it on Instagram on her story. Subsequently, that review has like 5.5 million impressions. Now, what I have to do as a critic is be like, okay, that's a weird phenomenon. It doesn't have any effect on my work. You know, it's like I have to be equally received, but how can it not?
Yes.
Right?
Because
I mean, I'm a human.
I've had the experience of writing about Bob Dylan and them blurbing a review on the album sticker or whatever. Right.
No, I've had that recently. Yeah.
And I'm like, how do I live with, like, or they put it on the website and you're like, you know, I've heard from people in those camps, like, well, sometimes they do, like the artist will read it. I'm like, Bob Dylan is reading potentially a stupid thing I wrote, you know, or like, it is a weird phenomenon when you're in love with someone. It is, it's parasocial. They put out a record, you hear it and listen to it, and maybe you write about it or whatever, you cover it somehow. The notion that they would hear that, still, I've been doing this a long time, it mystifies me. And I don't know about you, but will that experience not heighten your own interaction with the next Taylor Swift record?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you have to, I think we critics, media, people who write about culture, we have to admit that, yes, that's happening. And, you know, maybe I can sit here and say to you, well, I won't be affected by what Taylor Swift said about my record, but let's take it to a much more grassroots level. Like, for example, I love this singer-songwriter named Anna Tivell. She's not very well known. She's a folk singer-songwriter. She's based in Portland. And her record label did that with something I said about Anna and put it on blurbed, like on the latest record or one of her records. And you know what? I feel happy. I'm not going to lie. I want more people to listen to Anna Tivell.
Yeah.
I'm happy I could say something positive and that they could use it. But see, if I was really honest with myself, would I differentiate between how I feel about Anna and how I feel about Taylor Swift? I think this is the complexity. But one of the things, Vish, about our time is that it's a good thing to me that we are able to admit that we as critics are part of an ecosystem, and we are not separate from artists. We are not separate from the industry. We don't stand apart. Objectivity isn't a real thing. I mean, there is no true objectivity. What you have to cultivate is more like an equanimity or enough distance that you can say, like, if Anna put out a record that I hated, that I hope I could say, this one isn't as good as your last one, you know?
Yeah.
But that's what you have to check. And then you have to recognize that at times you are going to be swept up into this parasocial relationship. And I think we have to say that is just part of it. You know, that is just part of the ecosystem that we live in.
Yeah. I think where I'm at with it is like, I sometimes worry I've insinuated myself into this
I get it.
grander thing. Like, you know, the fact that some of my favorite artists are aware of me or want to talk to me or appreciate things I've written about them. It happens from time to time, and I'm just, I don't know. Like I say, it's not imposter syndrome per se, but it's close. Like I'm at peace with it, but like it is interesting to be part of the dialogue, because like what I'm saying is most fans don't get the dialogue, that sense of dialogue.
No, exactly, completely, and. Many fans feel they do more being able to communicate on social media or whatever, but not to get too deep into the influencer thing, but to stick with the critic thing. I mean, hopefully your work does have value in and of it. I mean, I don't mean hopefully. Your work does have value. My work has value in and of itself.
Yes.
And, you know, when someone, whether it's a musician or someone in the industry or just a fan of music, says, I loved reading this piece you wrote about whoever. Matty Healy from the 1975. I wrote a big, long, huge piece about him as a dirtbag, as the paragon of this idea of the male dirtbag. And I actually heard through his publicist that he liked it and he'd love to have a conversation at some point. And I'm like, well, that's cool. Yeah. But that wasn't why I wrote it. Like, and I wasn't immediately like, oh, well, let's get together next week. Yeah. I wrote that piece because I was working out some stuff of my own through his music and his persona. And I wanted to work out these ideas. And that's where I try to operate. Now, that said, there's another level of music writing that is more about discovery. And the ethics of discovery, that is a time, we could have a 2-hour conversation about that. Yeah. I think we have to be as honest as possible about how we're discovering music, how we're benefiting from an artist's success, if we are. Are we a little bit too susceptible to the flattery that publicists put our way, for example?
I have pondered this, and I do honestly feel that I'm, in my own work anyway, I'm trying to platform things I think are interesting or people I find are interesting. Like, that's my main goal. And I'm trying to not sound like a martyr or maybe more unselfish than I am. I don't know. Like, I am part of the deal with everything I've done. Like, I wrote it or I recorded it or whatever. But I feel, I personally think I'm a facilitator to try to get more people to find out about something. And that's why this show is not me just monologuing for an hour. It's trying to say, hey, everyone, check out Ann Power's new book about Joni Mitchell. It's unbelievable. So I think some of us wrestle with that. But I think that grounding is something that I found fascinating about the book towards the end of the book, is that you and other fans and critics of Joni's wrestling with her renaissance. That I found really, really fascinating. And before we wrap up, I just want to touch upon it because that's the time we're in. We're in a Joni Mitchell renaissance.
A Joni-sance.
A Joni-sance. And part of it is imbued with, or rather colored by the fact that she had she defied death on some level and defied complete debilitation. Can you talk about this section where you quote other clearly fans wrestling with this new, joyous Joni? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, that was definitely a risk I took in the book because I think one of the phenomena of our highly parasocial time is that I think people get swept up in these kind of mass distributed emotions. I don't know how to say it, but like we get swept up into the excitement of the crowd and
hype.
Just to dip back to Taylor for a minute, like it's interesting to me that it seemed like all critics were like loving her, and then there's kind of this instant change. And I think there is a way that people get swept up into the public narrative and feel it personally. Yeah. And so I was feeling that with Joni. Now, I want to say, above all, I'm super grateful to everyone who's brought her back into the public eye and who have, been part of this journey she has of healing. It's really moving and it's incredible. And if nothing else, it allows for her impact to be recognized again, However, and it was Michelle Mercer, who is a fellow Joni biographer and scholar, who wrote something where she said, I think she was watching The Gorge Show, or maybe she was watching Newport or something. And she's like, I'm happy for her, but this is not my Joni. This isn't the Joni I value. I like the swaggering Joni of the Shadows and Light tour, or whatever Joni you pick, that's the Joni I like. And I identified with that, I felt that too. I don't want Joni, especially after this immersion and this absolute, this falling in love with the prickly Joni, I don't want the prickly Joni to be gone. And, but I will, in the end, what I end up saying is like, I think we have to acknowledge that as part of fandom too. Fandom is, we create that particular moment or that particular version of our star that we love,
Oh,
Maybe I like,
you described it earlier as phases, right? Phases.
Yeah, people, right. So maybe, you like Dylan, of you like 65 Dylan or 75 Dylan, or who knows, maybe you love Shot of Love. I don't know what Dylan you love, but...
So I'll tell you that this is really telling, because I think in the book what we discover about Joni is that she really is dialed into, or rather, each of her artistic expressions are really of a time. Like,
yes.
They're of the kind of technological and sociocultural time, of course,
Absolutely.
but they're also of her time and her trajectory.
Yes.
And, you know...
Yes.
I've thought about this a lot. There's a whole generation of people around my age who swear that Time Out of Mind, 1997's Bob Dylan, is the greatest Bob Dylan. And you know why?
Absolutely.
But you know, and then there's boomers who say, what are you talking about? It's Blonde on Blonde. It's Highway 61. That's because we were of a time. That's our time.
Exactly.
I came of age and got to start seeing Bob Dylan shortly after that. That's the album that I was like, wait a minute, this guy I've been reading about. And I heard his music. I took out the greatest hits from the library as a kid, and and the Beastie Boys would sample him or cite him, and the Beatles. I was a Beatles obsessive, so every Beatles book, you end up reading about Bob Dylan and his influence on them. So I was curious, but sometime in what is that? My second or third year of university, Time Out of Mind comes out, and I grab it from the University of Guelph newspaper review section, and I put it on. I'm like, what the hell is this? That's not what I was expecting. Whoa, oh my God. And I loved it. And that's my time with him. So there are people who have different Joni periods or different whoever, and they may not make sense to really you like that. The last part of Miles Davis, well, that's when I saw him. Like that's what I relate to, because it's important to me. And Joni, I think, says that, like, you know, if you're looking to learn more about me, it's really you're learning about yourself. With my song. So, sorry, I went on a ramble, but do you know where I'm coming from?
No. Yeah. I met a lot of millennials for whom Night Ride Home or Turbulent Indigo was the entryway for Joni, you know? And there was a tribute concert in 2000 that was broadcast on American television. I think that was an entryway for a lot of people.
A Grammy Award will do that, right? Like
anything.
A late period Grammy Award, yeah.
Right. And I think one way to sort of define or identify great, I mean, you know, the term great is also suspect and problematic and all of those things. Yeah. But, you know, these long-lived artists who have many phases of their careers are, to me, the ones who are the most exciting to follow and try to understand how they keep evolving. And that's the thing about her, is like she found a way in every different, even in her retreat years, you know, quote unquote, there were still, whether it was her own music, the less frequent albums she made, or it was like the use of her music in popular culture that changed things, you know, the Love Actually scene, where, you know, scenes, the love of Emma Thompson for Joni Mitchell in that movie, whatever. And with Dylan, it's like a similar thing. Like, he keeps getting renewed. He keeps renewing himself. And then there's like 5 or 6 Dylans at once. That's what Todd Haynes' movie I'm Not There is all about.
Absolutely.
Which is the greatest Dylan movie, and there doesn't need to be another one. Sorry, Timothy Chalamet. But
it is a phenomenal film. I do think it's telling in the 2 examples we're citing, Dylan and Joni, that renewed interest and celebration from us came after health scares. So when you think about Time Out of Mind, Dylan, for those who don't recall, had a health scare and had to go to the hospital. It was a heart thing. Joni, similar thing. I think arguably you could say that both of them came out of those experiences a little cheerier. And I think, I don't know that you and I maybe have had the experience of, well, I shouldn't speak to that and I don't want to get too morbid, but I think when you confront your own mortality, and if you're lucky to escape it, you come out the other side more appreciative and joyous about life. So I was reading these sections about people in your book, rather, being like, I miss the curmudgeonly critical Joni. And I'm like, yeah, but she almost died.
Exactly.
And probably didn't know if she'd ever walk, speak, do anything again.
Exactly.
So what you're seeing to me, and what I value about some of these older artists, is life is short. And my life is even shorter. Like Willie Nelson's in his 90s, And when the last time I saw him was with Bob, I'm just looking at the poster here, with Bob Dylan and John Mellencamp in Syracuse, New York, many years ago now.
Oh, wow.
Willie was diminished even then. I've seen Willie a few times.
Right.
But I celebrated it. Like, I didn't feel a wanting for the old Willie. I don't go see Bob Dylan now thinking, I hope he sounds like he did in 1966. Like, that's just not my feeling. I want to celebrate the trajectory they're on. Again, another ramble, but I do think, as I read these sections, I'm like, she's probably just happy to be here. Really?
No, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's what you're getting. And I do, I think that, and I said this to Brandy Carlo also, I think the Joni Jam as a unit, as a band, kind of has evolved over the several appearances they've made to be supportive of where Joni's at as an artist now in a really delicate way. So, I think it's been interesting to see how that's evolved and how as her voice grows stronger, the kind of invisible hands of the Joni Jam participants grow more invisible. And that's exciting. But to your point about like going to see the older performers, I wrote a column about this for NPR. I mean, it must have been at least 10 years ago. And it was about Willie and Neil Young. And it's funny that I wrote that 10 years ago saying, go see these artists who knows how long we'll have them. And it was 10 years ago now. Yeah. But I agree, like there's, especially Willie Nelson, there's real pleasure in just seeing him in his complete IDGAF phase. Yeah. And just what he likes to do is kind of this ambling, almost jazz, very meditative approach. And it's really different than when I saw him, say, in the 90s, when he was just barreling through his hits. So as long as an artist keeps changing and evolving, I think they're worth seeing. We were talking about Leonard Cohen, and you were speaking of like how health problems and facing mortality can give us great work. And I mean, is there a better example than Leonard Cohen? I mean, by the end of his life, that last record, he was in quite a bit of pain and really struggling, but he really like walked us right up to the door of where he eventually went through. Well,
I mean, the last time I got to see him live, I was in tears. Like I lack emotion, so I don't cry, but he brought me to tears. And, and it's just occurring to me, and this is a wild tangent. Both Neil Young and Joni Mitchell had polio. Both suffered aneurysms.
Yes. Wow. That's crazy.
I never even thought of that until just now, because I can't chart it, because Neil has always been very prolific, but just to tie my theory together that maybe that brush with mortality renews people's vigor after they come out the other side. There's probably something to it. I just don't have, again, Neil's just been prolific forever, it feels like.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think it's tempting and valid to make generalizations like this and make those connections. A lot of people have, specifically about polio with Joni, with Neil Young. I mean, I don't think her childhood bout with polio was like the source of her artistic drive, as David Yaffe talks about that in his book. I agree with Michelle Mercer that she was already perceiving of herself as an artist, but there's no denying that going through these physical struggles, especially as a musician, affects your musical approach. So, I mean, we can at least say she never would have developed the guitar style that was so influential if she hadn't struggled with weakness in her hand. Yeah. Neil Young may have never developed that careening electric sound he had if he didn't struggle with seizures, and struggle with issues that caused him to perceive the world in a shaky way that made his music like that. Yeah. So, I think you don't want to ever reduce an artist to their affliction.
No, but I do think when they come out the other side, you're seeing a celebratory artistic expression, maybe like...
The funny thing about the Dylan thing with Time Out of Mind that I reflect on a lot is I remember when that record came out and thinking, oh my God, he's so old. He's like an ancient bard. And he was like, what, 52 or something, if that? Yeah, I mean, he was not old. So it is funny to realize how, we perceive of these musicians as like ancient bards when they're like 50 something. You know? But
and particularly if you're a woman in any kind of creative realm, ages, people ascribe traits to you based on your age, which sucks. And Anyway,
but I'll say like Joni's image is one of the most the funnest things about the Joni Jam, like how she's evolved this sort of Joan on her throne thing, to quote James Taylor once said about her, Joan on her throne. But, I love the way she comes out in these resplendent, in these robes and with her cane and with her
and it's
beret.
It's adorable. They've designed the stage to be like her living room. Like, it's adorable.
And it reminds me of kind of like late period Aretha Franklin, for example, and like embodying that royalty that I love that. Let's acknowledge these queens when they're alive. Even though I think Joni Mitchell's never not been acknowledged, she's not an underdog. She never was an underdog.
No, I think you get to that in your book. Like, she gets tagged as underappreciated, but how is that possible? Like, so many people say she's the greatest person to ever do what she did. So.
Exactly.
And, I think you also say in your book about it's, based on what I was saying earlier about this latter-day remorse for the old Joni, I suppose.
Yeah.
You're also acknowledging that she is getting her flowers. She was on the Grammys for the first time.
Exactly.
And people were in tears, as I recall.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Which brings me to the fact that, as I recall from your book, maybe you and others were a bit reluctant to attend any of these recent performances. But I believe as we're speaking, there is a Joni Jam scheduled, I think, in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Are you planning to attend?
I don't know. Let's see how Joni responds to the book. I don't want to go if she's going to be throwing things at me.
Are you concerned about her reception? I know you write very confidently, I think, about how, and I think you're entrenched in the notion that you're a critic. Like I said earlier, this is not a hagiography, but we're approaching publication date. That you already talked about the nerves. There can be dread from everyone involved. How is this going to be received? But again, in this notion of connecting with the artist you do clearly love.
Yeah.
Can you describe your sensation you're feeling right now?
I mean, I'm a human being, so of course I'm nervous about whether she will denounce me or people around her will denounce me, whatever. However, I will say two things. One, I'm feeling good because the book has been well received so far. But more to the point, I think I have to try to cultivate an attitude of like, okay, if she's mad at me, that puts me in an elite group too. She's gotten mad at most of her biographers. So, and most of the people who've written extensively about her, she's had arguments with, and as it should be. I mean, I am being presumptuous in telling the life of another person.
Yeah.
And that is, when I quote Janet Malcolm or Hermione Lee, these great theorists of biography, and say, every act of biography is in a sense a murder. That would be Janet, or we're violating people. And so I have to be able to take it as well as dish it out, I guess.
Yeah. And I will say, for those, we've talked about the fact that you didn't speak with Joni herself. The amazing amount of research, the people you did speak with, it's like it's remarkable, and some of them have passed away since you've spoken with them. I'm sure you must have thought, when you reached out to people like David Crosby or Graham Nash or whomever, just given their awe of Joni and their respect for her, you must realize that some of them were like, hang on a second, just a second. Hey, Joni. This person.
Oh, definitely.
Are you aware that? Is she aware that you?
No, people would ask me. She's aware. She was aware of the book and through the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I know that was something people could check on. And there were certain people who, at first were like, I'm not going to talk to you. And then much later, as I did years of research, and it became clear that I was doing years of research and that I was talking to all these people. Then they came back and they're like, okay, yes, I'll talk to you. So I hope everyone who reads the book feels that I did my due diligence, and that's all I can really hope for,
I mean, you've already talked about your own positioning as someone who was drawn to people who were somewhat outspoken. Who might respect a more outspoken or uncompromising attempt at telling a story than Joni Mitchell? I don't know.
Exactly.
I have found sometimes after I step back from writing something or talking about something about someone, that their voice can kind of enter my expression?
Yes.
Did you find that? Like, I'm writing about
Well,
Joni, and this is maybe how she would talk about some of this stuff.
Well, you have to just be resistant to constantly quoting her lyrics, and it's so hard because her lyrics are so good, and so often when you're writing about her work or even just about the context of her work, a lyric of hers will enter your mind because it is the best way to describe it. So you just have to be careful about that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think, hopefully in the end, I found my voice in dialogue with her voice, and that was sort of the goal. I mean, how could I match her as a writer? I mean, it's another friend of mine recently wrote a book about, my friend Evelyn McDonald wrote about Joan Didion, and we talked about this. She wrote a book called The World of Joan Didion. Again, like having to consciously resist letting the subjec's voice take over. And I mean, who has a stronger voice than Joan Didion? But what Evelyn and I both agreed on is like, ultimately you are staging a kind of ongoing conversation with this subject. And just as you and I, if we talked for another 3 hours, would start to echo each other's words, that's going to happen,
Yeah.
So,
well, for what it's worth, coming from me up here in Canada, it's a really brilliantly written book. I found it completely compelling and just made me want to delve into Joni's work and life, I suppose, even more. So I just want to close by saying a few things. One, again, congratulations.
Thank you.
And don't worry, it's going to be received well. You'd have to be a moron not to like this book. They even put that on they should blurb the book that way. Bish Khanna. No, I'm just kidding. So
there you go.
No.
I want to say I have a couple of events coming up. I have a Toronto event. I have to look up the date.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you if we could do some of that future planning and announcement stuff. And so, yeah, I wonder about book events for this actual title. And then, Anne, I don't know if it's too early for you to talk about anything you're working on beyond spreading the word about this book, but I'd love to hear about that. As well.
Well, so I have an event in Toronto. It's the Toronto Public Library Series, and that's on the 17th of June. So please do come out,
nice.
Toronto friends, if you're listening. And then I'm coming to Calgary on, I believe it's the 30th or the 31st. I haven't completely got all the details on that. But so those in Calgary,
cool.
Pay attention.
Cool.
Look at the calendar, and hopefully we'll see if more invitations to come. Any invitation to cross our northern border, I will accept.
Okay. If
anyone's listening out there in Halifax or Vancouver, just let me know. Yeah. So, and I'm also, for American listeners, I'm doing an event on June 22nd at the Kennedy Center in DC.
Oh, wow.
And I know it's kind of daunting, but please come to that. We need to fill that room.
Are these? I assume these are moderated discussions.
Yeah, they're conversations and with different people. And then I have one in Seattle on the 25th of July, and then there'll be more in the fall. Like I'll be doing some book festivals and things. But the one in Seattle is at Third Place Books, so that's my hometown. Okay. So I'm happy to be doing that. As far as what I'm working on, well, my wonderful team at NPR Music was very tolerant of me as I was completing this book. So I'm focusing on my actual job to a certain extent, I write the newsletter. So please sign up for the NPR Music newsletter and do the different podcasts and stuff. And then my next project is going to be an anthology of my own work that I'm doing for UT Press. And so I've got to turn toward that, and hopefully that will be coming out in the maybe next year, hopefully.
Sorry, University of Texas
Press.
Okay, just making sure.
An amazing music series that Jessica Hopper is involved in. A lot of great editors there. So I'm really excited to do that. And delving back into the many, many, many thousands of pieces I've written over the years. So.
Oh my gosh. Well, I can't wait to read that, and not to, be presumptuous. If you ever want to return to this show to talk about anything you're working on, Anne, please feel free.
Anytime. Yeah. I love it. I loved your questions, and I loved your conversing with you. And and just looking at your posters on your wall while we were talking.
Oh, yeah. I get a lot of comments on those. I guess that's understandable. And
I see shellac. We have to say R.I.P. Steve Albini. I see a shellac poster up there. No, it's a very cool office. So I wish I had more posters on my wall. But
no, your office looks lovely. Just to getting back to the plug stuff, you mentioned some tour dates. If people want to learn more about you, Anne, or follow you in the modern parlance, where would you like to direct them?
On most socials, I'm at Ann K. Powers. So that would be like Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, Ann K. Powers. And check out NPR Music online. That's my main gig. So those are the best ways to follow me.
Do you have a website of your own?
No, not right now.
Okay. You've been talking
get on that.
Been talking about that recently with all these platforms, convulsing or whatever they're doing. Maybe websites are the way to go. So I was just curious. Yeah.
And I don't have a Substack. Like I said, I've been writing the NPR Music newsletter, and that's been a great place. But believe me, I think about these things, and I do own all my domain names, so I should probably put them to use at some point. I think actually, Vish, it's interesting to think about where the future of archiving of music criticism goes.
Yeah.
And when I'm looking at someone like Robert Christgau, my mentor, he has an amazing website, and
it's like a Geosites website, isn't it?
It's Geosites. I think so. It's been around forever.
I just went to it this year for something, and I was it's so old school, but
it's so old
charming.
School. It's super cool, right? It's super cool.
Charming.
And it has, he had some help creating it, but it has all of his work archived, which is amazing. So, that's a lot of work, but.
I'm sure you've seen it, Anne, when these here in Canada or wherever, when Vice says we're done, I see all my colleagues are like, I'm downloading the thing and here's an app you can use, like all these websites. Sorry, I guess what I'm getting at is
it's scary.
It's autonomy. It's like we did all this work and trusted to be on this website, and then completely mergers and acquisitions, and you lose your writing. Yeah. And I've been lazy. Yeah. I've been lazy about it. I'm like, I send so much stuff into the endless maw of the internet. I'll do my best with my own website. But anyway, sorry, wild tangent.
It's important to archive your work because your work is not just your own. It's also a part of history. So that's why I think it's important to archive your work. At the same time, I think, I try to adopt something of a Zen attitude as well and be like, well, my work is in part in dialogue with my moment, and it changes. That changes all the time. So, I can't get too worried if I lost a review I wrote in 2009 or something. But at the same time, it's a paradox because that is our work and we should have possession over it.
And sometimes it's instructive for your own current practice. Every once in a while I'll stumble upon something and I'll be like, that's me. Like actually in 2009, exactly. I was pretty much me. Like I was wildly off base. So I find it instructive in that regard as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we'll keep track of you online on social media and stuff, and the book is out on Day Street. As we're speaking, it's out on June 11th, and it's wonderful. Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation. It was a tremendous honor and pleasure for me, and I hope we speak again soon. Best of luck in the future.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much. What a fun conversation. Such great questions. Thanks.
A real treat for me to get to hang out and spend time talking about music and the world with the great Ann Powers. I hope you enjoyed it too. This is the 875th episode of Creative Control, which is part of the Entertainment One podcast network and is available wherever you get your podcasts. If you can't find an episode you're looking for, or if you want to learn more about me and sign up for my monthly newsletter, please visit vishkhanna.com. Also, click on the hyperlink text that says follow Vish online to, follow me online on social media and whatnot. Most significantly, please visit patreon.com/creative control to make a flexible monthly donation to sustain my work as a music person in this thing of ours. $6 or more a month grants you access to exclusive content and every single episode of this show going forward. Without that $6 subscription, you will get you'll be aware of every single episode, but you won't hear them all in their entirety. Every other episode, you'll just hear an excerpt. But with the $6 a month subscription, or higher, I should say, then you get everything. So if you're so inclined to hear every single word that me and my guests spend, talking with each other there, please visit patreon.com/creative control to support me and this show today. Thank you so much for even contemplating doing that. I also want to thank some independent businesses, Pizza Trocadero, The Bookshelf, and Planet Bean Coffee in Guelph, Ontario, and Granddad's Donuts in Hamilton, Ontario, for their in-kind support for this show. Jim Guthrie is a lovely musician and person who has loaned me music for this show. You can learn more about him at jimguthrie.org. Come to think of it, the only time I've ever visited the NPR facility in Washington, D.C. is when I got to go, I drove, I did some road managing, I suppose, getting the Jim Guthrie Band down there for a Tiny Desk concert. So I owe Jim a lot, and he's a good friend of mine. Anyway, support Jim and listen to his music at jimguthrie.org. And finally, thank you so much for listening to this episode with Ann Powers. Do pick up a copy of her wonderful new book, Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's really, really something else. Otherwise, I hope you will subscribe to this podcast or follow it and leave a nice rating and review on your pod platform. And ask your friends to do the same. Tell your friends about the show if you don't mind. They might be looking for something to listen to, and if you like the show, maybe they will too. Or just do nothing. Be yourself. Have a good time in life. And hopefully you'll hear me and my next guest by keeping tabs on this show. Thanks again. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now.